Do you remember the forgotten side dishes only Grandma's cookbook had? These simple dishes brought warmth and togetherness to everyday meals. When did we stop making the foods that once held us close? Copper pennies were more than just a colorful dish. They were a reminder that simple vegetables could still feel dressed up when times were tight. These were sliced carrots marinated in a tangy sweet sauce made from vinegar, sugar, and sometimes just a dash of dry mustard. The recipe usually came from a stained card in Grandma's tin box, the kind she would pull out for church potlucks or Sunday suppers. You could serve them cold or slightly warm, and the flavor only got better after a night in the icebox. The bright orange color stood out on even the most modest dinner table, and they were easy to make in bulk with very little fuss. Canned carrots worked just fine if you had no fresh ones, which helped stretch this into leaner seasons. And while the name might sound silly now, anyone who grew up with them remembers how good they looked lined up beside the ham or roast. Some people even thought it was the one way they liked carrots. But somewhere along the way, this cheerful little side dish faded into memory, tucked between pages of cookbooks that no one opens anymore. Harvard beets were the kind of side dish you either loved with all your heart or politely pushed around the plate. But back in Grandma's day, they were something special. Tender beets, simmered in a glossy, sweet and sour sauce made of sugar, vinegar, and a touch of butter or cornstarch for thickness. Sometimes cloves or allspice were added, giving them a spiced holiday feel that filled the room the moment they hit the stove. These beets had a deep ruby color that practically glowed in the bowl, and they were often served warm alongside pot roast or meatloaf. You would see them at church suppers, family holidays, or just because someone had canned a good harvest. They were a lesson in thrift, too, stretching garden beets through the winter with just a few pantry ingredients. People used to say Harvard beets were named after the university, but no one ever really cared. What mattered was that they gave even humble root vegetables a bit of elegance and shine. These days, you are more likely to see beets roasted with goat cheese than nestled in a sticky glaze. Peas and pearl onions were a staple of wintertime cooking, especially when fresh vegetables were hard to come by. Grandma knew how to make something special out of pantry basics, and this dish was proof. Canned or frozen peas were gently warmed with tender pearl onions, often from a jar, and simmered in butter or a light cream sauce. The result was simple but comforting, with just enough sweetness and bite to sit perfectly alongside roast turkey or baked ham. You would see it on holiday tables, often scooped out of a deep ceramic dish with a worn wooden spoon. Some families added herbs like thyme or parsley, but the heart of the recipe never changed. It was about taking small, soft vegetables and giving them care, warmth, and just a bit of love. Peas and pearl onions did not shout for attention. They were the quiet kind of dish that stuck with you anyway. They are almost never made anymore, except by the rare home cook flipping through a dusty cookbook. But for the folks who remember, one bite can bring back a dozen meals from long ago. Tomato aspic salad was one of those strange creations that could only have come from a time when gelatin ruled the kitchen. It was a savory molded dish, tomato juice thickened with unflavored gelatin, then loaded with chopped celery, olives, or green peppers, depending on what Grandma had on hand. The result? A firm, wobbly side dish served cold, usually cut into slices or cubes and placed proudly next to roast beef or deviled eggs. People either adored it or found it baffling, but no one forgot it. Tomato aspic was especially popular at luncheons, bridge clubs, and church picnics, where presentation mattered just as much as taste. It looked refined, in a retro sort of way, and was always served with a smile. The tangy, lightly spicy flavor made it oddly refreshing in the summertime, even if no one asked for seconds. Some recipes even added a dab of mayonnaise on top to finish the look. Today, tomato aspic is more often the butt of jokes than a dish on the menu. But for those who grew up with it, it brings back memories of glass dishes, ruffled tablecloths, and a different kind of dining pride. Ambrosia salad was not really a salad in the way we think of salads today. It was a dessert disguised as a side dish. Grandma would fold together canned mandarin oranges, crushed pineapple, shredded coconut, mini marshmallows, and whipped cream, sometimes with a spoonful of sour cream to give it balance. It was creamy, sweet, and just fancy enough to make it onto the holiday table next to the turkey or ham. For many families, this was a taste of celebration. Kids loved it for the marshmallows, adults appreciated the simplicity, and everyone agreed it belonged at every potluck. Ambrosia was the kind of thing that made it into every community cookbook. Easy to make, hard to mess up, and always a crowd pleaser. You could throw it together with pantry items, let it chill for a few hours, and it would hold up just fine. Some versions added maraschino cherries or pecans for a little extra flair. These days, you might see similar flavors in retro-themed desserts, but the original Ambrosia has mostly disappeared from our tables. Maybe it was too sweet, too fluffy, or just too old-fashioned. Succotash with lima beans was not just a dish, it was a Depression-era survival tool that somehow made it into Grandma's regular rotation. Sweet corn and soft lima beans were simmered together in a little butter or cream, sometimes with bell peppers or onions tossed in for good measure. It was filling, cheap, and surprisingly nutritious, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch every last dime. Succotash had deep roots too, traced back to Native American cooking, and became especially popular in the South and Midwest. If your grandma had a victory garden, you probably had succotash at least once a week. It was served warm, spooned right from the pot, and though it was never flashy, it was honest food. A dish that said, "We have enough to share." Some people added bacon or ham to punch it up, others kept it plain and let the vegetables speak. But the core recipe stayed the same for generations. These days, succotash barely makes an appearance outside of history books or heritage festivals. Scalloped corn casserole was one of those cozy, golden-topped dishes that never needed a main course to shine. It started with sweet corn, fresh, canned, or creamed, mixed with milk, eggs, a bit of sugar, and crushed saltine crackers or breadcrumbs. Then it was baked until it set into a soft, custard-like center with a crispy, buttery top. This dish showed up at potlucks, funerals, holiday dinners, anywhere people came together and needed something warm and familiar. You did not need a lot of money to make it, just pantry staples and a steady oven. The smell alone was enough to call everyone to the table. Some versions had chopped peppers or bits of onion, others stayed simple and sweet. But no matter how you made it, it had the same purpose: comfort. Scalloped corn casserole made vegetables feel indulgent, like something you could take pride in bringing to a neighbor's house. It was the kind of dish that lived in handwritten notes and passed down recipes, not cookbooks with glossy photos. And somewhere along the way, it got pushed aside for flashier sides. But for those who remember, it will always be the taste of home. Creamed celery was the quiet guest at the table. Never the centerpiece, but always welcome beside a roast or baked chicken. Celery might not sound exciting today, but back then it was a dependable staple, easy to grow and even easier to find at the corner grocer. Grandma would simmer sliced celery until just tender, then bathe it in a velvety white sauce made from milk, butter, and a dusting of flour. Sometimes she would add a splash of broth or a sprinkle of nutmeg to make it more elegant. It was soft, mild, and deeply nostalgic, food that asked nothing of you except to slow down and enjoy it. You would find creamed celery at Sunday suppers, Easter dinners, and any meal where someone wanted to show they cared. It was not flashy, but that was never the point. It reminded people of gentler times, of manners and matching dishes and sitting down to eat as a family. These days, celery is more likely to end up in juice or chopped raw into a salad. Wilted lettuce salad sounds like something gone wrong, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was magic. She would start with tender leaf lettuce, picked fresh if she had a garden, and pour a hot dressing made from bacon drippings, vinegar, sugar, and salt right over the top. The leaves would soften slightly, just enough to take on the tangy, savory warmth of the dressing. Sliced onions or hard-boiled eggs were sometimes added depending on the season. It was best eaten immediately, while still warm, and it felt like a treat, even though it was made from next to nothing. The flavor was bold, salty sweet, and impossible to forget. Wilted lettuce was especially common in the Appalachian South and the Midwest, where thrift met tradition in the best ways. It turned plain greens into something special without needing cheese, croutons, or bottled dressing. These days, people want their salads cold and crisp, but there was something deeply satisfying about a bowl of warm greens straight from Grandma's hands. Corn oysters were one of those Depression-era dishes that did not have a lick of seafood but still felt like something fancy. Grandma would mix corn, usually fresh or canned, with eggs, flour, and a bit of milk to make a thick batter. Then she would fry little spoonfuls in hot oil or bacon grease until they puffed up golden and crispy around the edges. The name came from the way they looked, round, plump, and golden, like a fried oyster. But they were made of nothing more than corn and love. These fritters were often served as a side dish with soup or meatloaf, or even stacked up for breakfast. They were quick to make, easy to stretch, and always got eaten before they had time to cool. Kids loved them, adults counted on them, and they used up whatever corn you had on hand. Some folks added chopped peppers or onions for extra flavor, but the original was good enough all by itself. Corn oysters were proof that you did not need much to make something satisfying. You just needed a hot pan, a good spoon, and a little bit of memory. Green tomato relish was one of those tangy little extras that brought bold flavor to plain meals even when the pantry was bare. Grandma would take firm, unripe tomatoes, too stubborn to ripen before the first frost, and chop them finely with onions, peppers, and vinegar. Add sugar, mustard seeds, and celery salt, and you had a thick, bright relish that woke up whatever it touched. It was spooned onto meatloaf, smeared onto sandwiches, or set in a bowl next to pork chops and roast chicken. It had that vinegary punch that made you sit up a little straighter with every bite. People canned it in glass jars and lined their shelves with it like treasure. It was a late summer ritual in many homes, part of the rhythm of putting up food for winter. Green tomato relish was born out of waste not thinking, salvaging fruit that otherwise would rot on the vine. But it also brought a surprising brightness to heavy meals. You almost never see it now, not even in farmers' markets. But anyone who tasted it remembers it sharp, sweet, and impossible to forget. Stuffed baked onions were the kind of dish that made you think Grandma knew a little magic. She would peel and hollow out big yellow onions, then fill them with a warm mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and maybe a bit of sausage if meat was on hand. Then she would roast them until the outside was soft and golden and the center bubbled with flavor. The smell alone would bring people into the kitchen. It was impressive without trying too hard. Just an onion, transformed into something elegant. You might find them at a Sunday dinner or as a side for a special roast. They looked like something out of a restaurant, but were made from the humblest ingredients. Stuffed onions stretched the grocery budget and elevated whatever else was on the plate. You would cut through the tender layers with a fork and get a mix of sweetness and savory warmth. It is hard to imagine a time when onions took center stage like that, but Grandma knew how to make the most of what she had. Today, we just chop them and toss them in a pan. Back then, they were stars. Rice-stuffed bell peppers were a dish that turned summer garden bounty into something worth remembering. Grandma would take big, shiny peppers, green or red depending on what grew best, and hollow them out with care. Then came the filling: cooked rice mixed with cheese, vegetables, tomato sauce, and sometimes ground beef or beans. She would bake them until the peppers softened and the tops browned just slightly. The dish smelled like comfort itself, bubbling quietly in a worn-out casserole pan. These stuffed peppers were served warm, but tasted just as good the next day out of the icebox. They were frugal, filling, and full of flavor, ideal for feeding a crowd with just a few ingredients. For many families, they were a way to use up leftovers and still put something beautiful on the table. The colors alone made them feel like a celebration. They are still made here and there, but often buried under cheese or too fussy to feel the same. The original ones were about balance, vegetables doing the heavy lifting, rice carrying the weight. They were summer in edible form, baked in love. Cottage cheese salad was the quiet hero of mid-century potlucks and family suppers, even if no one talks about it much anymore. You would start with a scoop of plain cottage cheese, soft, tangy, and mild. Then fold in fruit like pineapple, sliced peaches, or even chopped tomatoes depending on the occasion. Some versions leaned sweet with whipped cream or gelatin, others stayed savory with cucumbers or chives. Either way, it was a refreshing, creamy dish that needed no cooking and very little prep. It was served chilled on a lettuce leaf or in a glass bowl, the kind that caught the sunlight just right. It might not have turned heads, but it always got eaten. Cottage cheese salad was something you made when you wanted to offer something light, simple, and just a little different. It was affordable, nutritious, and versatile, ideal for hot summers or holiday tables alike. Today, it has all but vanished, replaced by packaged sides or dressed-up grain salads. But those who remember it know how comforting that cool, creamy bite could be. Sometimes the quietest dishes are the hardest to forget. German potato salad was never meant to be cold, and that was the beauty of it. Grandma would boil red potatoes until tender, then toss them with crisp bacon, diced onions, and a sharp vinegary dressing while everything was still warm. The result was tangy, salty, and just a little sweet, rich from the bacon but lifted by the vinegar. It was a staple at summer picnics and church potlucks, served straight from the pan or kept warm under foil. Unlike the creamy versions most people know today, this one had no mayonnaise and needed no chilling. It felt more like a real dish than a filler side, and it paired perfectly with sausages, roast chicken, or just a good slice of rye bread. You might find a recipe scribbled in pencil in the back of Grandma's cookbook, passed down from a German aunt or neighbor. It was hearty, practical, and impossible to stop eating once you started. These days, it is rare to find someone who still makes it from scratch. But the warmth, both literal and emotional, is something no cold potato salad can match. Cornmeal mush was a dish born out of need, but remembered for its quiet comfort. Grandma would cook cornmeal slowly with water or milk until it thickened into a soft porridge, then pour it into a pan to chill overnight. By morning, it would be firm enough to slice, and she would fry it in a hot skillet until the edges turned crisp and golden. It was eaten with butter, syrup, or even a fried egg on top, whatever the pantry allowed. This was not flashy food, it was sustenance, plain and simple. But it filled bellies, warmed cold mornings, and never cost more than a few cents to make. Some people grew up thinking of it as Southern fare, others knew it as polenta, but in Grandma's kitchen it was just cornmeal mush. It showed up at breakfast more often than not, especially during lean months. These days, it is almost never mentioned outside of old cookbooks or Appalachian food blogs. But it deserves a second look. Few dishes stretch so far, last so long, or feel quite so honest on a plate. Glazed turnips were one of Grandma's ways of making stubborn vegetables taste like something worth getting seconds of. She would peel and cube them, then simmer them in a pan with butter, sugar, and a splash of broth or vinegar until they were soft and glossy. The natural bitterness of the turnip mellowed into something sweet and earthy, with a flavor that felt oddly fancy for such a humble root. Glazed turnips were often served beside roasts or ham, especially when the fancier vegetables were too expensive or out of season. It was the kind of dish that showed up quietly, then disappeared just as quietly. No fuss, no leftovers. A lot of kids wrinkled their noses at first, but ended up going back for more. You almost never hear about this recipe now, not even in family newsletters or holiday cookbooks. But there was a time when turnips had their moment, and Grandma made sure of it. It was not about turning vegetables into something they were not. It was about bringing out the best in what you had. Creamed cucumbers were a summertime staple, cool, tangy, and surprisingly comforting. Grandma would slice cucumbers paper thin and let them sit with salt until they softened just enough. Then she would stir in a mixture of cream, vinegar, sugar, and dill to create a light, soupy dressing that clung to every bite. Served cold in a glass bowl, creamed cucumbers were the answer to long, hot days and heavy main dishes. They were crisp, clean, and a little bit indulgent in their own way. You could eat them with fried chicken, pork chops, or all on their own with a slice of bread. It was one of those recipes that looked effortless but had just the right balance of flavors. It cooled you down without making you feel like you were missing out. Nowadays, you might find cucumber salads with yogurt or fancy vinaigrettes, but the original creamed version has almost vanished. That old-school charm, the soft herbs, the tangy cream, has been quietly replaced. But there is something about the way it felt to scoop out a chilled bowl and take a bite that felt like it belonged to home. Spinach timbales were a dish that made vegetables feel like something grand. Grandma would mix cooked spinach with eggs, cream, and a handful of breadcrumbs, pour the mixture into small molds, and bake them until they puffed and set. The result was a delicate, custard-like mound that held its shape and tasted rich and savory. It looked fancy, but was often made from leftovers or frozen spinach, which made it even more impressive. These little timbales were served warm with a drizzle of cheese sauce or gravy and were a regular part of dinner parties or special Sunday meals. They had that old-fashioned air of formality that came from caring about presentation, even when money was tight. Spinach timbales were quiet showstoppers, the kind of dish that made people stop and take note without saying a word. They are rarely seen today outside of vintage cookbooks or culinary schools, but for a time they were proof that vegetables could be elegant too. Maybe we would all eat more greens if they were served like this again. Parsnip and carrot mash was a rustic dish that felt both hearty and refined, depending on how Grandma served it. She would boil peeled carrots and parsnips until soft, then mash them with butter, salt, and just a dash of cream or broth. The result was a golden mash with a hint of sweetness and a whisper of spice, thanks to the natural flavors of the vegetables. It was lighter than mashed potatoes, but still deeply satisfying. Often served alongside roast chicken or pork, it brought color and comfort to the table. Parsnips had a stronger flavor than carrots, so Grandma would sometimes tone it down with a bit of apple or potato if she had it. The mash was served hot, usually with a pat of butter melting into the top, and it filled the kitchen with a rich, earthy smell. These days, most people skip parsnips altogether or never think to mash them, but this was a dish that stretched garden roots into something nourishing and beautiful. It was humble food made with care, and that made all the difference. Potatoes. Anna looked like something you would see at a fancy restaurant, but Grandma made it with nothing more than a sharp knife, a heavy pan, and a little patience. She would slice potatoes paper thin and layer them with butter. No shortcuts, no fuss. The pan would go on the stove first to crisp the bottom, then into the oven to bake until golden and crackling on the edges. When she flipped it out onto a plate, it came out in one perfect buttery circle. The center was tender, the outside crisp, and every bite was simple but rich. Potatoes Anna might sound French, and it is, but like many things, Grandma made it her own. You could find it next to roast beef or a pork chop, or sometimes served all by itself when there was not much else. It was elegant without being complicated, and filling without being heavy. These days, you would need a mandolin and a YouTube video to pull it off. But Grandma just had her hands, her memory, and a cast-iron skillet. And that was all she needed. Jellied cabbage salad might sound like a dare today, but in Grandma's kitchen, it was a dish of pride. This was not some jiggly dessert. This was savory gelatin, made with cabbage, carrots, vinegar, and sometimes a hint of onion or celery. The gelatin was clear and firm, often made with tomato or lemon juice instead of just water. The vegetables were suspended in it like little windows into the garden. It was served cold, sliced into neat squares, and always had a place at the table during luncheons or church dinners. Some versions were topped with mayonnaise or set into ring molds with a little lettuce garnish in the center. You had to have grown up with it to understand why it mattered. It was refreshing, texturally strange, but oddly satisfying. Today, we turn our noses up at savory gelatin, but back then, it was a sign of effort and hospitality, a dish that took time, not shortcuts. Maybe it is time we looked at those odd recipes again, with curiosity instead of judgment. Creamed pearl tapioca was a dish that confused most people the first time they saw it, but it had a quiet charm that stuck. Grandma would cook the tiny pearls slowly until they turned translucent and soft, then fold them into a thick, savory base with cheese, onions, or even bits of ham or mushrooms. It was like a casserole crossed with a pudding, strange, but comforting. The texture was warm and creamy, with a soft bite that held everything together. You would not find it on many dinner tables today, but back then, it was a way to stretch ingredients and use up pantry staples in unexpected ways. It was often baked until the top turned golden and set, then scooped onto the plate beside a roast or served in ramekins for something a little more refined. It had a richness that felt out of place for how inexpensive it was to make. Most people remember tapioca as a sweet dessert, but this version belonged to the savory world, and it was a world all its own. Baked stuffed apples were not always about sugar and cinnamon. In Grandma's kitchen, they could be savory too, filled with sausage, breadcrumbs, and chopped nuts or onions. The apples were cored and packed with the mixture, then baked until soft and just slightly caramelized on the outside. The stuffing soaked up the apple juices and turned into something warm and earthy with just a hint of sweetness. It was the kind of side dish that blurred the lines between sweet and savory in the best way. Served with pork chops or roast poultry, it brought balance and surprise to the plate. You might have seen them during holidays or Sunday dinners when Grandma wanted to offer something memorable. They looked beautiful too, rustic and golden, with a scent that filled the kitchen. Nowadays, we think of apples as pie or snack food, not as a vehicle for stuffing. But once upon a time, they held more than sugar. They held creativity, thrift, and a kind of elegance we do not always recognize anymore. Dilled green beans were crisp, cold, and full of bite, the kind of dish that cut through a heavy meal and made you feel a little more awake. Grandma would blanch fresh green beans just until tender, then toss them in a marinade of vinegar, sugar, water, and plenty of fresh dill. Sometimes there was garlic too, or a few mustard seeds, but the real star was always the dill. The beans would soak overnight in the fridge and be served chilled the next day, usually from a glass bowl with little drops of condensation on the rim. They were bright, tangy, and a little bit sharp, perfect next to meatloaf, pork roast, or even a big baked potato. Dilled green beans were common in summer when the garden gave more than you could eat in one sitting. They were refreshing, frugal, and quietly sophisticated. Not quite a pickle, not quite a salad, just their own thing entirely. These days, they have almost vanished from potlucks and picnics, but the flavor still lingers if you ever get the chance to taste it again. Hot fruit compote was the kind of side dish that brought comfort in the coldest months of the year. Grandma would bake a mix of canned or fresh fruits, apples, pears, peaches, cherries, together with a little cinnamon, sugar, and maybe a splash of orange juice or brandy. Served warm, it was sweet but not sugary, soft but never mushy. It sat beside baked ham, roast beef, or pork tenderloin, and offered a gentle sweetness to balance all the salt and spice. Compote made use of whatever fruit was around, even the bruised or overripe pieces. It was practical and indulgent at the same time. Some versions added raisins or nuts, others leaned on citrus zest for brightness. Either way, it made the kitchen smell like something special was happening. Today, most people do not think to warm fruit as a side dish, but once, it was a small gesture of love, something to round out a meal and make it feel whole. You can almost still taste it if you close your eyes. Creamed chipped carrots were never flashy, but they had their place in Grandma's dinner rotation. She would slice carrots thin, sometimes with a hand crank slicer, and simmer them until tender, then fold them into a creamy white sauce with butter and flour. The sauce was just enough to coat the carrots without drowning them, adding a gentle richness that softened their natural sweetness. You would find them beside meatloaf or roast turkey, sometimes served in little ramekins or scooped straight from a saucepan. It was a quiet dish, comforting in a way that did not ask for attention. No spices, no tricks, just care, warmth, and the steady flavor of carrots made special. They were easy to prepare, cheap to make, and always familiar. These days, carrots are raw in lunchboxes or roasted with glaze, but the creamed version is nearly forgotten. Yet there was a time when this simple dish brought real joy to the table. It deserves more than silence. Cornbread dressing was the kind of dish that only showed up on special occasions, but it left a lasting impression. Grandma would bake cornbread ahead of time, then crumble it and mix it with sautéed onions, celery, herbs like sage or thyme, and rich broth. Sometimes there were bits of sausage or chopped hard-boiled eggs, depending on what was in the pantry. Then it was baked until the top was crisp and the inside soft and steamy. It was served alongside turkey, of course, but also made appearances next to pork roasts or stewed chicken. Cornbread dressing was hearty, flavorful, and deeply southern in its bones. It filled the kitchen with the smell of warmth and care. Everyone had their own version, passed down like a secret. Now, boxed stuffing mixes have replaced it on most tables, but that homemade blend of savory herbs and cornmeal still lives on in memories. Some things boxed breadcrumbs can never replace. Breaded eggplant rounds were a summer favorite that tasted like fried sunshine. Grandma would slice eggplants into thick coins, dip them in egg and breadcrumbs, sometimes with a bit of cornmeal, and fry them until golden and crisp. They were salty on the outside, creamy on the inside, and just hearty enough to stand in for meat when money was tight. You could serve them on their own, with tomato sauce, or tucked into a sandwich with melted cheese. They were messy to make and disappeared faster than she could fry them. The best ones were fresh from the garden, deep purple and still warm from the sun. Eggplant was not always a kid favorite, but this dish changed minds quickly. It was comfort food with a little bit of crunch and a lot of history. Today, eggplant shows up more in global recipes than in Grandma's style of home cooking. But back then, it was a clever way to make something simple feel satisfying. Creamed sweet onions were considered a bit fancy in Grandma's day, but they were easy enough to make on any evening that called for something comforting. She would simmer peeled pearl onions or chopped sweet onions until just soft, then cover them in a rich, buttery cream sauce made with milk, flour, and a pinch of salt. The whole thing came together in a saucepan, thickened gently until the onions were tender but still held their shape. Served in a shallow bowl, creamed onions brought warmth to a plate of roast beef or pork chops. They were mild, slightly sweet, and had a depth that came from slow cooking and patience. These onions were often seen on Thanksgiving tables or Sunday spreads, adding elegance without flash. You do not see them much now, too subtle maybe, or too old-fashioned. But one bite of those soft, creamy onions and you remember what made them special. Creamed peas on toast points was one of those simple yet oddly elegant sides that showed up on dinner tables and cafe menus all across America, especially when money was tight. You would simmer soft peas in a creamy, buttery sauce, spoon them over crisp triangles of toasted bread, and serve them with roast meats or as a light lunch all by themselves. This recipe came straight from those old faded cookbooks where frugal, filling meals ruled the kitchen. It proved even basic ingredients like canned peas and day-old bread could turn into something satisfying when you got creative. Back in the 1940s and 50s, meals like this helped families stretch groceries while still feeling polished and proper at the table. Creamed peas on toast points showed up at Sunday suppers, holiday dinners, and even tea time spreads because it was comforting, affordable, and easy to whip together when groceries were running low. It might sound simple now, but back then, this creamy, green-topped toast was a welcome sight. Sardine and onion sandwiches were one of those quick, no-frills meals that filled hungry workers up fast and showed up in plenty of lunch pails across America. You opened a tin of sardines, laid them on rye bread, added some raw onion slices, and that was it. Simple, salty, and ready in under 10 minutes. It might sound harsh now, but back when protein was hard to come by and groceries were scarce, this was a go-to meal. The sardines gave you the protein, the onions added bite, and the rye bread kept you full. You would find this sandwich scribbled into old cookbooks, passed around among factory workers, or tucked into lunch boxes for folks heading out the door. It was never fancy, but it worked. Today, most people have forgotten how handy meals like this were, but back then, sardine and onion sandwiches helped plenty of families stretch what little they had and stay full through long, hard days. Scrambled eggs with evaporated milk were one of those frugal breakfasts tucked inside old homemaker guides and church fundraisers from the 1940s through the 70s. The secret was canned milk, You would crack your eggs, whisk in a splash of evaporated milk, and fry them up fast. The milk made them fluffy, rich, and stretch further than plain eggs alone. This mattered more than people today might think. During wartime and lean grocery weeks, a can of evaporated milk was gold. It lasted longer than fresh milk, cost less, and made ordinary eggs feel like a treat. Some families tossed in herbs or cheese if they had extra, but most kept it plain. Soft eggs with just a little salt and pepper. Quick, simple, and done in under 10 minutes. You will not find this recipe on Instagram or in trendy brunch spots, but it kept families fed and mornings moving. People used what they had, made it work, and turned humble ingredients into something satisfying. Sardines on rye with onion and mustard was the kind of dinner that proved you could survive on pantry food and still eat something with bite. You opened a can of sardines, layered them cold onto slices of rye bread, and topped the whole thing with sliced onion and spicy mustard. That was dinner. It was salty, briny, sharp, and came together in minutes without a stove or oven in sight. This meal showed up in old cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards for one reason: it worked. Sardines were cheap, packed with protein, and lasted forever in the cupboard. Rye bread had enough bite to hold its own, and the mustard gave everything a sharp kick that kept it from feeling too plain. You ate it open-faced, with a fork and knife if you felt proper, or just with your hands when time was short. It was quick, practical, and oddly satisfying, even when the grocery budget was running on empty. Funny how the simplest pantry meals stuck with us, long after times got easier. Speaking of Southern traditions, this next one was a staple too. Yeah, let's turn our attention to pork jowl, an often overlooked cut of meat that's been a staple in Southern barbecue for years. The pork jowl was basically the cheek of the pig, and while it might not sound glamorous, it was packed with flavor and had a unique texture that barbecue lovers appreciated. It's fattier than bacon, but with a more intense flavor. Smoked or barbecued pork jowl was typically seasoned with a blend of spices and then cooked slowly to develop its rich, smoky flavor. Pork jowl might not be the most mainstream barbecue item these days, but it's a delicious example of how barbecue traditions make the most of every part of the pig. Stewed zucchini with tomatoes was one of those quiet, dependable side dishes that showed up on dinner tables when garden produce was in full swing and folks needed to stretch meals without spending extra money. You would slice up fresh zucchini, toss it with onions, canned tomatoes, maybe a little garlic or herbs, and simmer it down until soft, saucy, and comforting. It was simple, affordable, and practical, making it a favorite in community cookbooks and handwritten recipe cards from the 1940s through the 70s. Families leaned on dishes like this to use up garden harvests or swap in pantry staples when fresh vegetables were scarce. Stewed zucchini with tomatoes showed up at potlucks, Sunday dinners, and quiet weeknight meals, adding a little color and comfort to whatever main dish you managed to scrape together. It might not have been the star of the table, but it was the kind of side that kept everyone full and satisfied, especially when budgets were tight. You do not see it much outside of vintage recipe collections today, but back then, it was a thrifty, nourishing dish that brought humble ingredients to life. Baked bean toasties were the kind of quick, hearty meal you could throw together with just a few ingredients and still feel like you had something warm and filling on the table. You toasted up some sandwich bread, heated a can of baked beans, and spooned them over the top with a sprinkle of shredded cheddar if you had it. It sounds basic, but when you were short on groceries and stretched for time, this meal worked wonders. The beans were filling, the toast added crunch, and the cheese made it all feel a little more special. You would see this simple meal show up in New England kitchens, packed into lunchboxes, or scribbled into old cookbooks full of fast, affordable recipes. It was not about being fancy, it was about getting something hot and satisfying on the table in under 10 minutes. Today, people might forget how handy meals like this were, but back then, baked bean toasties filled a lot of hungry bellies without breaking the bank. Poached egg. Overstewed tomatoes was the kind of savory breakfast you would only find in old church cookbooks or handwritten recipe cards from a neighbor down the street. It was practical, filling, and ready in under 10 minutes, even if it sounded a little fancy. You would poach an egg, ladle some stewed tomatoes onto a plate, and serve it all with day-old biscuits or plain toast. The tomatoes were sweet and tangy, the egg added protein, and together they made breakfast that actually stuck with you through the morning. Families leaned on meals like this when money was tight and groceries were limited, especially during the Great Depression or lean years after the war. You did not need much: canned tomatoes, an egg, maybe some stale bread, and suddenly breakfast felt warm, filling, and just a little different than the usual toast. These meals disappeared as boxed cereals and frozen breakfasts took over, but back then it was one of the quiet ways people got through the morning with what little they had. Minute rice with canned chili and cheese was the dinner of champions. If your definition of champion was someone who worked 12 hours and still had to put food on the table. That old minute rice box was a lifeline back then, cooking up fluffy in just a few minutes. You dumped canned chili right over the top, shredded some cheddar if you had it, and dinner was done. Nobody expected it to be gourmet, but it filled you up, stuck to your ribs, and made sure you were ready for the next shift, the next chore, the next whatever life threw at you. The cookbooks from those days leaned hard on pantry meals like this because they worked. They were honest, quick dinners that kept you standing, even when life tried to knock you down. And hey, melted cheese makes everything better. Now, squirrels aren't the only bushy-tailed animals on the list, because barbecued rabbits were the talk of the town in the early 20th century. In rural areas where game meat was more common than store-bought cuts, rabbit was a go-to option. Think of it as a tender, flavorful rabbit marinated in a tangy sauce and then grilled to perfection. It's like the barbecue equivalent of a Sunday roast, but with a bit more pizzazz. The barbecued rabbit was often seasoned with a blend of herbs and spices that set it apart from other barbecue options available. Rabbit barbecue wasn't as exotic as a squirrel, but it was still pretty uncommon. It was a staple in many rural barbecues. People would gather around the pit, sharing stories and swapping rabbit recipes. But as times changed, so did tastes. It's a shame, really. I mean, low-fat, high-protein, and finger-licking delicious. What's not to love? Peach cottage cheese ring was the light, fruity side that felt fancy enough for luncheons and church gatherings, but came from pure thriftiness. You would mix cottage cheese with gelatin, chill it in a mold, and serve it sliced with canned peach halves nestled in the center. It looked polished, used pantry staples, and added sweetness to a plain meal. Recipes like this popped up everywhere, from community fundraisers to backyard picnics, adding color and a little protein to the table when produce was scarce. Peach cottage cheese ring balanced between salad and dessert, offering a cool, refreshing break from heavier dishes like fried chicken, meatloaf, or casseroles. Families leaned on molded salads like this to stretch groceries and make meals feel complete. It might sound quirky now, but back then, seeing that glossy, fruit-topped ring on the table meant your hostess brought care to the meal, no matter the grocery budget. It was simple, thrifty, and filled with quiet kitchen pride from a time when every dish had to count. Leftover biscuit with syrup or gravy drizzle was one of those Depression-era breakfasts that made sure nothing ever went to waste. You would take yesterday's biscuit, stale or not, reheat it, and pour canned gravy or a drizzle of syrup over the top. Suddenly, leftovers became breakfast in under 10 minutes. Families leaned on meals like this when the cupboards were bare and payday felt a long way off. It was not fancy, but it filled your belly and kept mornings moving. Syrup sweetened things up, gravy made it savory, and both stretched the little bit of food you had into something satisfying. Farmhouses, boarding houses, even factory kitchens knew this trick by heart. You could find it tucked away in old homemaker guides and church recipe swaps, quietly keeping people fed when groceries were scarce. Some meals disappeared quietly, but back then, this one carried families through lean times with nothing but yesterday's bread and a little creativity. Quick potato flake pancakes were one of those practical budget dinners born from the back of old pantry shelves. You grabbed a box of instant potato flakes, mixed them with water and a little egg if you had it, then shaped the dough into small pancakes and fried them up in butter. That was dinner. It came together in 10 minutes flat and filled you up with simple, salty, crispy goodness. These pancakes were a staple of old cookbooks that loved pantry meals you could make fast with whatever was on hand. No peeling, no mashing, no waiting for potatoes to boil, just flakes, water, and a hot skillet. You could add herbs or cheese to dress them up, but most families kept it simple. They were crispy on the outside, soft in the middle, and filled your plate without much effort. This was dinner that made the best of tight grocery budgets and busy nights. Funny how something as humble as potato flakes could feel like a proper meal when you needed it most. Scalloped cabbage bake was the kind of side dish that stretched a head of cabbage farther than you thought possible, and it came straight out of those old community cookbooks where frugal comfort food was king. You would slice the cabbage, soften it in boiling water, then bake it in layers with creamy sauce, breadcrumbs, and sometimes a little cheese if you had extra on hand. It sounds simple, but when it came bubbling out of the oven, golden on top and rich underneath, it turned cabbage into pure comfort food. Families leaned on dishes like this during the Great Depression and World War II, when ingredients were scarce and every meal had to go the distance. Scalloped cabbage bake filled plates at church suppers, potlucks, and Sunday dinners all across America, sitting proudly next to ham, roast chicken, or casseroles. It might not win any beauty contests now, but back then it meant a warm, filling meal made with care. In tough times, even the humblest cabbage could be turned into something worth gathering around the table for. Cottage cheese and peach. Half plate was the kind of quick meal that felt just fancy enough to pass for lunch, even when the fridge was nearly empty. You opened a can of peach halves, plopped them on a plate, and added a big scoop of cottage cheese right in the center. That was it. 10 minutes, maybe less. It sounds odd now, but back then, this sweet and savory combo showed up at church teas, ladies' luncheons, and weekday meals when time and money were both running low. It was light, refreshing, and filled just enough of that hunger gap to get you through the afternoon. You could dress it up with a little sprinkle of nutmeg or a cherry on top if you were feeling fancy, but most kept it simple. It came from a time when canned fruit was a pantry staple, cottage cheese counted as protein, and families got creative to stretch every dollar. Another forgotten classic from the old cookbook that kept homes running smoothly. Banana and wheat germ smoothies were the forgotten health food breakfast from the 1970s, back when nutrition guides promised energy in 10 minutes or less. You would blend a banana with milk, add a spoon of wheat germ, and maybe toss in honey if you had it. That was breakfast, quick, filling, and just trendy enough to feel like you were ahead of the curve. Parents loved it for being affordable, teens liked it for the simplicity, and health fads leaned hard on it as a protein-packed, no-fuss morning meal. It showed up in old diet books, homemaker columns, and those paper recipe handouts at grocery stores. Wheat germ was the health food of its time, promising fiber and nutrients without all the heavy cooking. Smoothies were new enough to feel exciting but easy enough to show up in every busy household. Somewhere along the way, this breakfast got lost behind flashy protein powders and complicated smoothie bowls, but back then, it quietly kept families full with nothing but fruit, milk, and a blender. Cold beans and onion salad was a no-cook dinner pulled straight from the cupboard that showed up again and again during lean times. You opened a can of kidney beans, drained them, and tossed them with sliced onion, vinegar, salt, and pepper. That was dinner. It might not sound like much now, but when the summer heat made turning on the stove unbearable, it was a lifesaver. These little bean salads filled old cookbooks from the 1930s to the 70s because they were quick, cheap, and practical. The vinegar gave it tang, the onions added bite, and the beans packed enough protein to get you through the night. You served it cold, right from the fridge, and ate it with a fork straight from the bowl. It was filling, salty, and satisfying when groceries ran low and energy ran even lower. Families leaned on meals like this because they worked. They filled you up fast, cost next to nothing, and kept the kitchen cool. Funny how the simplest pantry meals stick around longest. The Southern loved making use of every part of the pig, and this next one was no exception. I'm talking about chitterlings or chitlins. These are the intestines of the pig. And while they might not be the first thing that comes to mind when you think of barbecue, they've been a beloved part of Southern barbecue culture for generations. Barbecued or smoked chitlins are prepared by thoroughly cleaning and cooking the intestines until they're tender and flavorful. The key to making chitlins enjoyable is all about seasoning and preparation, turning what might seem like an unusual ingredient into a delicious barbecue treat. Now, I'm not saying everyone will love them, but they definitely have a loyal following. But like many traditional foods, chitlins are falling out of favor. It's a sad day for those who appreciate the bold flavors of the South. Buttered parsley potatoes were the kind of humble, forgotten side dish that quietly filled plates and satisfied appetites across America, especially during lean times. You would boil small baby potatoes, toss them in butter, sprinkle with chopped parsley, and serve them up next to roast beef, fried chicken, or whatever you had on the table that night. It was not flashy, but back in the day, that was the whole point. Simple, affordable, filling, and easy to dress up with ingredients straight from your garden or pantry. You would find recipes like this tucked in the pages of faded cookbooks from the 1930s to the 70s, passed along at potlucks and family dinners. Buttered parsley potatoes were proof that you did not need much to make a side dish feel complete. They soaked up gravy, balanced out heavier meals, and stretched your groceries farther when money was tight. These days, they have slipped off most dinner tables, but back then, a bowl of buttery potatoes meant you brought comfort, simplicity, and just a little bit of pride to the meal. Saltine cracker stackers were the kind of quick, sweet snack that kept busy families going when there was not much else to work with. You grabbed some saltine crackers, spread on peanut butter, added banana slices, and drizzled honey over the top if you had it. 10 minutes, maybe less, and you had a snack that stuck to your ribs. This little recipe was everywhere back then, passed around in school lunchrooms, scribbled into community cookbooks, and tucked away in kitchen drawers for emergencies. It sounds simple now, but in a time when grocery budgets were tight and sweet treats were a luxury, saltine cracker stackers filled the gap. They gave kids energy, kept parents sane, and showed just how creative families could be with a box of crackers and a few pantry staples. It might seem forgotten today, but for plenty of households back then, this quick little snack was a lifesaver. Jelly roll-ups on white bread were the quick breakfast treat every kid from the 1950s to the 70s knew by heart. You would flatten a slice of white bread, spread on a little jam, roll it up tight, and slice it into pinwheels. Breakfast was done in under 10 minutes, fun to eat, and easy enough that even kids could make their own. Families leaned on meals like this when mornings were rushed, but you still needed something sweet to start the day. It was a trick you would find in lunchbox guides, homemaker columns, and those old spiral-bound cookbooks hiding in every kitchen drawer. Some folks added peanut butter, others kept it plain with jelly. But either way, it turned bread and jam into a quick, cheerful breakfast that actually stuck with you. Somewhere along the way, roll-ups disappeared under cereal boxes and toaster pastries. But back then, it was one of those small, forgotten meals that made mornings just a little brighter. Boiled egg and sweet pickle sandwiches were the fast, quirky little dinner that came together in minutes when you needed to stretch groceries. You mashed up boiled eggs, mixed them with diced sweet pickles and mayonnaise, and spread the whole thing between slices of soft white bread. That was dinner. It sounds a little strange now, but it filled you up, stretched a carton of eggs, and cost next to nothing. These sandwiches showed up in old cookbooks from the 1940s through the 70s because they were practical, easy, and satisfying. The eggs added protein, the pickles gave sweetness and crunch, and the soft bread pulled it all together. You could eat it plain or toss in a little pepper if you wanted to dress it up, but most folks kept it simple. These were the dinners that filled plates fast, stretched budgets, and got families through tight times. Funny how the oddest little combinations stick with you long after the hard years pass. Okay, now that we've covered the respectable mutton, let's move on to something a bit more, shall we say, adventurous: smoked squirrel. In the early days of barbecue, this little critter made quite a splash at gatherings. If you think about it, the squirrel is kind of like nature's version of a barbecue snack: small, tasty, and with just the right amount of seasoning. The smoked squirrel was typically prepared by slow smoking the meat until it was infused with a rich, smoky flavor. It was a favorite among pioneers and early settlers who needed to make the most of their resources. While it might sound a bit unusual today, it's a great example of how barbecue traditions evolve based on what's available and what people enjoy. These days, you might not see a smoked squirrel on your local barbecue menu, but it's definitely a dish that deserves a place in barbecue history. Hot bacon spinach salad was the hearty side that disappeared when lighter, trendier salads took over, but back then, it was a real crowd pleaser. You tossed fresh spinach with onions and poured warm bacon grease and vinegar dressing over the top so everything wilted down into tangy, savory perfection. It sounds decadent because it was, and it balanced out roast meats, casseroles, or whatever you were stretching that night. Recipes like this filled cookbooks from the 1940s to the 60s when families turned humble staples and garden greens into something satisfying. Hot bacon spinach salad was a smart way to use greens before they wilted and bacon grease before it went to waste. You would find it at church suppers, family dinners, or tucked in handwritten recipe cards, quietly filling plates. It faded off most tables today, but back then, this rich, tangy salad was one more trick for turning basics into something worth savoring. Hot dog and baked bean skillet was one of those quirky 10-minute meals that could only have come from Grandma's old cookbook. You sliced up hot dogs, tossed them in a skillet, and poured in a can of baked beans. That was it. Dinner done. It sounds ridiculous now, but back when money was tight and every meal counted, this was comfort food at its quickest. The beans were filling, the hot dogs gave you just enough protein, and you could stretch one can to feed the whole family. Some folks got fancy with mustard or onions, but most kept it plain. It was the kind of dish that showed up after a long workday, when you were too tired to fuss with complicated recipes but still needed to put something on the table. It bubbled away on the stove, filling the kitchen with that warm, smoky smell that meant dinner was ready. Today, it feels like one of those meals we forgot on purpose, but for families back then, it was a lifesaver that showed up fast and kept bellies full. Baked bean toast was the quick, savory breakfast that filled countless plates across New England when mornings were rushed, but you still needed something hot and satisfying. You would toast a slice of bread, spoon on canned baked beans, maybe top it with cheese or butter, and slide it under the broiler. Breakfast was done in under 10 minutes, hearty enough to carry you through a long day. Families loved it because it was affordable, practical, and good enough to stretch one can of beans into a meal for the whole house. Old cookbooks, factory lunch guides, and frugal homemaker magazines all praised this trick for making mornings easy without giving up flavor. Some folks added mustard or hot sauce, others kept it plain, but either way, it was the kind of breakfast that quietly filled bellies when nothing else seemed to last. These days, it barely gets a mention, but back then, baked bean toast was one of those small comforts that made hard mornings feel bearable. Creamed corn and hot dog skillet was one of those meals that showed up when time was short and the cupboards looked bare. You sliced up those hot dogs, tossed them in a skillet, and let them simmer in a can of creamed corn until everything bubbled together. It sounds a little ridiculous now, but back then, it was comfort food at its most practical. This was not a recipe out of some fancy magazine. It came straight from the faded pages of those old spiral-bound cookbooks that every kitchen drawer seemed to have. Families on tight budgets loved it because it made use of pantry staples, and somehow, that sweet corn and salty hot dog combination worked. You could dress it up with black pepper or a little hot sauce, but most folks kept it plain. After a long day, this dinner showed up in 10 minutes flat, filling your belly even if your wallet felt empty. Funny how those quick meals stick with you long after the hard times pass. Let's talk about meat that's still enjoyed in some parts of the country, but definitely not as much as it used to be. Goat barbecue. Goat barbecue was known for its gamey flavor and tender texture, making it a favorite among those who enjoyed a bit of variety in their barbecue menu. Goat barbecue was typically marinated with a blend of spices and herbs before being slow cooked or grilled. So this one falling out of flavor is a big loss for barbecue fans because hear me out. Goat meat is lean, flavorful, and packed with protein. It's still a popular choice in many cultures for a reason. But as tastes changed, so did the demand for goats. It's a shame, really. Pineapple cheese salad sounds like one of those retro recipes that people talk about with equal parts horror and nostalgia, but this sweet and savory mashup was a potluck star once upon a time. You would mix canned pineapple chunks with shredded cheddar cheese and mayonnaise, sometimes tossing in a maraschino cherry on top to seal the deal. It sounds like a strange combination today, but back in the 1950s and 60s, recipes like this came straight out of the old spiral-bound cookbooks tucked in every kitchen drawer. People loved it for its bright, tangy sweetness and how easy it was to throw together with cheap pantry staples. Pineapple cheese salad showed up at luncheons, holiday tables, and potlucks, holding its own next to roast turkey, ham, or casseroles. It might raise a few eyebrows now, but back then, that quirky little salad was a way to dress up a meal and bring something special to the table without spending a fortune. In its day, this strange, creamy creation meant you came prepared. If these forgotten side dishes brought back a memory, drop your favorite in the comments, tap like, and subscribe to keep the taste of Grandma's kitchen alive.